In the biting cold of a Minneapolis night, a powerful man stood ready to slip back into his polished world, until a trembling voice shattered the silence. A little girl, barefoot and shivering, stepped from the shadows with a plea that cut deeper than any deal or fortune could. "Please, help my mom." Her words carried a secret so heavy it could crush even the strongest heart. In that frozen garage, a millionaire CEO found himself face to face with the one thing money could never buy: the chance to truly matter. What followed was not a story of business or power, but of courage, redemption, and the fragile thread of hope between a child and a stranger who chose not to walk away. Stay with us, because here at Hidden Echo Stories, every tale reminds us that kindness has the power to change everything. Subscribe now and never miss the next story. Cole Whitmore had spent his entire life chasing victories that looked impressive from the outside, but left him feeling hollow when the applause faded. At 42, his name carried weight in glass towers and boardrooms where fortunes shifted with a signature. Yet as another December day in Minneapolis drew to a close, the triumph of his third big deal that quarter felt strangely lifeless. The city outside his office windows was drenched in gray twilight, the snow reflecting the neon glow of brake lights snaking along the avenue below. Everyone congratulated him, voices rising with pride and envy, but inside he felt only exhaustion. His cuff links sparkled, his shoes gleamed, and his Rolex ticked faithfully on his wrist, but each polished detail seemed like a mask, one more layer over the gnawing emptiness in his chest. When the room cleared and silence returned, he let it wash over him like a guilty pleasure. The elevator hummed quietly, lowering him into the bowels of the building where his car waited. The garage was cold, concrete echoing each step, the air sharp with exhaust and faint winter wind. His phone buzzed constantly with reminders of dinners, messages from assistants, and updates about investors eager for his attention, but he ignored them all. He longed for silence, even if it pressed too close. It was in that silence, rounding a pillar toward the glow of his black sedan, that his world changed. At first, he thought it was nothing more than discarded clothes slumped against the wall. Then the bundle shifted, and his breath caught. A child stood there, barefoot on the concrete, shoulders wrapped in the tattered remains of what had once been a blue dress. Her arms hugged herself so tightly it seemed she wanted to vanish inside her own thin frame. She could not have been more than 8 years old, her chin pressed to her chest, dark hair tangled, tears frozen on her cheeks. Beside her lay a battered pink backpack, sagging under its own weight, as if everything she owned had been shoved inside and carried too long. For a moment Cole felt the old reflex stir in him, the same instinct that had guided so many of his choices. Keep moving, look away. Someone else will handle this. The world was full of broken pieces, and he had learned long ago that stepping around them kept life clean and manageable. His hand tightened on his briefcase, his steps angling toward his car. The plan was simple: pass by, slide into warmth, and leave the mess to security or fate. He had done it before, countless times, and each time told himself it was practical, not cruel. This time should have been no different. But she moved. Just as he drew even, the girl lifted her head and stepped into his path. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold cement, but her whisper did. "Sir," she said, voice frayed and trembling, "please help my mom." The words were so fragile he almost thought he imagined them, yet the desperation in her eyes cut through the air sharper than the winter wind. Something inside him stumbled. He crouched slowly, his expensive coat brushing the grit of the floor. He asked where her mother was, and the child's answer struck him harder than any market crash or hostile takeover ever had. "She is hiding," she whispered, "hiding from the man in our house." Her words shook, each one carrying more weight than her small body should ever have borne. Cole felt the breath freeze in his throat. His world of acquisitions and negotiations had never prepared him for this, a plea carved from fear and trust and innocence all at once. The old armor he wore, logic, detachment, control, crumbled against her gaze. He saw bruised cheeks, red-rimmed eyes, and a desperation that left no space for pretense. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, and the sensation was terrifying. He should have turned away. That voice inside him insisted he had no role in this, that he risked too much by getting involved. Yet he found himself reaching out, steadying her with a gentleness that startled him. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice rougher than he intended. "Let's get you out of the cold." She did not answer, only nodded, clutching her arms tighter. In her silence was a trust so fragile it almost broke him. She trusted because she had no other choice. Cole guided her to his car, holding the door as she climbed in with small, shivering steps. He slipped his overcoat from his shoulders and draped it around her like a shield. She disappeared inside the fabric, her thin frame barely a weight in the leather seat. His hands trembled as he slid behind the wheel. The garage around them seemed unnaturally still, as though the city itself was watching to see what he would do next. He realized with a jolt that for the first time in years, his decisions were not about profit margins or corporate survival. They were about one child's plea echoing in the darkness. As the engine rumbled to life, he glanced at her again. She clutched her backpack tightly as though it held her entire existence. Her toes curled against the heated seat, pink from cold, and her eyes remained fixed on her hands. He asked softly for her name. After a long pause, she whispered, "Emily." It was a name too delicate for the harshness of that garage. He repeated it quietly, committing it to memory as if saying it could somehow protect her. Driving out into the snow-frosted streets, Cole realized the path ahead of him was uncertain. He did not know where this would lead or what dangers lay hidden in Emily's words. What he did know, with a clarity that startled him, was that walking away was no longer an option. The emptiness that had haunted his victories, the cold that had seeped into every corner of his life, cracked under the weight of a child's whisper. And in that fracture, something new began to stir. Fear, yes, but also a purpose he had long forgotten. The drive through Minneapolis was hushed, the kind of silence that presses against the skin and fills the lungs with cold. Cole kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, though his knuckles ached with the strain. Streetlights slid across the windshield in pale streaks, illuminating Emily's small figure beside him. She sat curled inside his overcoat, the fabric swallowing her shoulders, her backpack cradled against her chest as if it contained her heartbeat. She had told him little so far, only fragments that cut deeper than 1,000 accusations. Her mother was hiding. The man they feared wore a badge. The thought churned in his mind, heavy and relentless. He glanced at her once, careful not to startle her. She did not return his look. Instead, she stared at the seam of the seat, her lips trembling though she made no sound. Every now and then she shivered, even though the car was warm. Cole wanted to speak, to offer reassurance, but the words stuck in his throat. What could a man like him, insulated by wealth and power, possibly say to a child who had known more suffering in her short life than he ever had? He felt the weight of his own inadequacy pressing in, and for the first time in years, silence felt like honesty. When they pulled into the glowing lobby of Westfield Equity, Cole's domain of pristine marble and polished steel, Emily looked even smaller. The security staff glanced up, their surprise barely masked. They had seen him arrive with investors and dignitaries, never with a shivering child clutching a faded toy rabbit from her bag. Cole ignored their stares and guided Emily toward a sofa. He placed a bottle of water in her trembling hands and crouched low to meet her gaze. His voice softened as he said he would call the police, the most logical step in a crisis. But Emily's reaction was instant, fierce in its terror. She recoiled, clutching her backpack so tightly he feared the seams would split. Her voice, sharp with panic, echoed in the cavernous space. "They do not listen. They know him. He wears a badge." The words slammed into Cole, dragging old memories with them. He remembered another plea years ago, a young accountant trembling as she tried to expose fraud. He had dismissed her concerns, filed them under compliance, and turned away. 2 weeks later, she was gone. Suicide, they said, but he had known better. He had known her voice carried truth, and he had chosen to silence it with his indifference. Guilt, usually hidden beneath spreadsheets and luxury, surged through him now, raw and electric. He looked at Emily, saw the same desperation in her eyes, and knew with chilling clarity that he could not fail again. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket, vibrating with the urgency of a world that once defined him. Meetings, investors, the endless stream of crises waiting for his command. He muted it. For the first time, business could wait. He lowered himself onto the sofa beside Emily, close enough for her to feel his presence but not trapped by it. She watched him warily, her small fingers rubbing the frayed edge of the backpack strap. He asked quietly why she had come to him. Her answer was a blade wrapped in innocence. "I saw your suit. Mom says people with money do not help. They only care about looking good." He wanted to argue, to insist he was different, that his foundation donated to causes, that he wrote checks and funded programs. But the truth hung heavy in the air. Those gestures had been distant, sterile, handled by lawyers and assistants. He had never gotten close to the pain, not like this. So instead of defending himself, he swallowed his pride and whispered, "Not this time. I am here because you asked." The words felt strange in his mouth, fragile but real. Emily studied him, her eyes sharp, testing the weight of his promise. Then, after a long pause, she nodded once. A deal made without contracts or signatures, only trust. Hours later, Cole found himself standing in a dim, battered duplex on a side street Emily had guided him to. The house sagged under neglect, its steps groaning as they climbed. Inside, shadows pressed against peeling walls and the air smelled of mildew and sorrow. Emily led him carefully through the darkness, past the clutter and silence until they reached the attic. There, on a thin mattress tangled with worn blankets, lay Rachel. Her skin was pale, her lips cracked, a bruise dark against her cheek. She looked impossibly fragile, her chest rising with shallow breaths. When she opened her eyes, panic flickered before recognition. Emily rushed to her side, whispering, "Mama, I brought someone. He is here to help." Cole knelt by the mattress, his throat tight. Rachel's voice was weak, barely a thread, but her words burned. "Do not let him take her again, please." Her grip on his wrist was trembling yet strong. He promised without hesitation, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. He had no plan, no guarantee, but in that moment he meant it. He would not walk away. He lifted Rachel carefully, her weight frighteningly light, and carried her down the narrow stairs. Emily clutched her rabbit and followed close behind, her small figure cutting through the gloom with quiet determination. Each step felt heavier than any deal he had ever closed, but also more necessary. Back in his car, Rachel's head rested against his chest as he arranged her in the back seat. Emily climbed in beside her mother, eyes wide with fear but also relief. Cole steadied himself at the wheel. This was not business. This was life and death. He drove through the sleeping city, calling ahead to a clinic where he had once donated, his voice urgent. "Prepare a room," he demanded. "I am bringing them now." At the hospital, lights blazed too bright against the fragile world he carried inside. Nurses rushed to take Rachel, but Cole stayed close, helping, shielding, murmuring reassurances that felt clumsy yet mattered. Emily clung to his side, her trust in him absolute, her small hand gripping his sleeve. As Rachel disappeared behind swinging doors, Emily stood in the waiting room, dwarfed by holiday decorations and sterile furniture. Cole crouched again, offering her socks and cocoa, helping her warm her frozen feet. "You did everything right," he told her. "You are safe now." His words cracked slightly, but her faint nod told him she believed him. For the first time, he realized that this little girl's belief mattered more than the approval of any boardroom. He stayed beside her through the night, canceling meetings, silencing his phone, and watching as she finally drifted to sleep with her rabbit tucked against her cheek. In that quiet, with the hum of machines and the weight of responsibility pressing down, Cole felt something inside him begin to shift. The life he had built on distance and detachment seemed impossibly far away. The only thing that mattered now was the girl who had trusted him not to leave, and the fragile hope of a mother fighting to survive. The courthouse loomed gray and imposing against the winter sky, its stone walls streaked with snowmelt, its steps slick beneath hurried feet. Cole adjusted his tie with a hand that trembled more than he wanted to admit. He had faced hostile boards, negotiated deals worth billions, and spoken with unwavering confidence in front of entire industries. Yet this morning, As he walked beside Rachel and Emily toward the entrance, he felt a vulnerability that unsettled him. This was not about profits or contracts. This was about survival, truth, and the fragile bonds he had come to treasure more than anything else. Rachel's blouse was neat but borrowed, her shoulders squared despite the nervous tremor in her hands. Emily wore a yellow dress chosen by a nurse, her hair braided carefully that morning, the stuffed rabbit tucked firmly under her arm. She clung to both her mother's hand and Cole's sleeve as if drawing courage from their presence. Together they stepped inside, swallowed by the dim, wood-paneled courtroom where echoes of whispered voices lingered. The judge, a woman with kind eyes, presided from the bench, her gaze steady and searching. Across the aisle sat the man Rachel feared, her abuser, with a public defender at his side. His eyes carried no remorse, only restless defiance. Rachel testified first. Her voice faltered at the beginning, brittle under the weight of memory. She spoke of nights spent hiding, of bruises, of fear that lingered even in her dreams. But as the minutes stretched on, her words grew stronger, steadier, fueled by a determination to reclaim her life and protect her daughter. Cole watched Emily's face, pale with worry, and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. When it was Emily's turn, the judge allowed her to hold her rabbit and sit beside her mother. The questions were gentle, but her answers carried the strength of a survivor. She told them about the attic, the nights of silence, the hope that someone might come. Her voice trembled but did not break as she said, "He listened. He did not leave." The room fell still at those words. Cole felt a lump form in his throat, pride and sorrow colliding inside him. When he was called to the stand, he rose with deliberate calm. The habit of adjusting his cuffs returned, but it felt almost absurd in this place. He spoke not as a CEO, but as a man who had chosen to stay when walking away would have been easier. He told them what he had seen, the bruises, the attic, the desperation etched into a little girl's face. He did not mention his wealth, his company, or his influence. None of that mattered here. All that mattered was the truth. A child had asked for help, and he had answered. The judge listened intently, pen tapping lightly against her notes. When she finally spoke, her voice carried warmth wrapped in authority. She granted Rachel full custody of Emily, with provisions for counseling and regular welfare checks. Then she appointed Cole as a temporary guardian, a safety net in case the unthinkable returned. The decision hit him with unexpected weight. It was not obligation he felt, but a quiet affirmation of what he already knew. He belonged with them, bound not by law but by choice. The judge turned her gaze to the man across the room. Evidence and testimony had painted a damning picture, and her ruling was firm. Bail denied, charges filed, custody stripped. 2 deputies moved forward, fastening cuffs around his wrists. Emily pressed herself closer to Cole, gripping his hand as the man was led away, his anger spilling in muttered curses that fell powerless in the air. For the first time, Rachel and Emily saw the door close on a chapter of fear that had defined their lives for too long. Outside, snow drifted in soft sheets, the world quieter, sharper, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Rachel exhaled a shaky sigh, relief loosening the tension in her shoulders. Emily slipped her small hand into Cole and asked with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, "Do we still get to stay with you?" He knelt to meet her gaze, his voice thick with emotion. "If you will have me, I will never stop showing up." Her eyes glistened and she whispered, "Then you are my real dad now." The words lodged deep in Cole's chest, both tender and shattering. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, her gratitude wordless but clear. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling of shadows and a tentative stitching together of something new. Rachel regained strength, her color returning as winter gave way to the first hints of spring. She began volunteering at the library, her voice steady as she read stories aloud, her eyes always finding Emily in the crowd. Emily blossomed at school, shy at first but soon running across playgrounds with laughter that carried in the air. She still carried her rabbit everywhere, but it was no longer a shield. It had become a companion, a reminder of how far she had come. Cole balanced 2 worlds now, the skyscrapers and boardrooms that had once defined him, and the small apartment above a bakery where he found laughter and warmth waiting. He painted their living room himself, built Emily a bookshelf that curved like a wave, and learned the quiet routines of family life. Saturday mornings meant pancakes, afternoons in the garden planting seeds, evenings filled with stories and crayons. He discovered that love was not in grand gestures, but in showing up again and again, in being there when the silence fell and someone needed to know they were not alone. One golden afternoon, as Emily sat in the garden sketching with her markers, she called him over to show her latest creation. Three figures stood hand in hand beneath a bright sun, a red heart floating above them. Beneath the drawing she had written one word in careful letters: home. Cole stared at it, emotion thick in his chest, as Rachel brushed a tear from her cheek. Emily smiled and said softly, "I am glad I found you that night." He pulled them both close, his voice rough as he answered, "You did not find me, Emily. You saved me." The city around them bustled, indifferent and loud, but inside that small garden the world felt different. The cold emptiness that had once defined Cole had thawed, replaced by something warmer, something lasting. He realized that home was not in the walls of glass towers or the weight of accolades. It was here, in the laughter of a child, in the strength of a woman who had survived, in the choice to stay when it mattered most. And as the sun dipped low and the evening gathered them close, Cole knew with certainty that he had finally found where he belonged. Sometimes the most profound transformations are not born in boardrooms or in the glow of success, but in the quiet plea of a child who refuses to give up hope. Cole Whitmore began his journey as a man surrounded by wealth, status, and influence, yet stripped of meaning. He lived behind polished glass, his life measured in contracts and deals, never realizing how empty it all had become until the night a trembling little girl stepped into his path and asked him to listen. Emily's voice carried more weight than all the numbers and accolades he had built his life upon. With her whisper, "Please help my mom," she shattered the walls around his heart and reminded him that true power lies not in control but in compassion. From that night forward, Cole discovered that love and courage could not be outsourced or delegated. They demanded presence. They demanded staying. Rachel's fight to reclaim her life and Emily's bravery in telling the truth became more than just their battle. They became Cole's redemption. Through each step, carrying Rachel down a rotting staircase, sitting through sleepless nights at the hospital, standing in a courtroom where fear met justice, he was forced to confront the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. And when Emily placed her hand in his and called him her real dad, he understood that family is not defined by blood alone, but by the choice to remain when it would be easier to leave. In the end, this was not just a story of survival. It was a story of rebirth. Rachel regained her strength, Emily found her laughter, and Cole discovered a sense of belonging he had never known. Together, they built something fragile yet strong, ordinary yet extraordinary. A home filled not with luxury but with trust, safety, and love. It is easy to believe the world is too cold, too harsh, too broken to change. But this story reminds us that every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every time we choose to stay can reshape not only another person's life, but also our own. Sometimes the greatest rescue is not about saving others, but about allowing ourselves to be saved in the process. And that is why we tell these stories, because in them we find echoes of our own struggles and glimmers of the hope we all need. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that compassion still has the power to heal, we invite you to join us. Subscribe to Hidden Echo Stories and be part of a community that believes in love, resilience, and second chances. There are more tales waiting, stories that will remind you that light can be found even in the darkest places, and that sometimes choosing to stay changes everything.